Hello, Earthlings and humanoids. Welcome to, what are we in, Module 5? Can you believe it, in our course on climate change philosophy? Boy, when I was putting this class together, I thought, oh, that's a long ways away, but here we are. We are in early voting season, at least in Texas, many parts of the country. And as I record this, we're just 2 weeks away from the election. So it's time to talk explicitly US presidential politics and climate change. Uh, we've done some of this already, and I really wasn't sure where we'd be at this point in this course in terms of what we covered. But I think we're doing pretty good. So I think I'm gonna give one talk this week on the Trump administration's climate change position, a talk next week on the Biden administration or what the Biden campaign plan, right? And then we'll kind of see where it goes from there on actual election week. Why not a third party or a fourth? Well, that's something we can maybe talk about if you want to join in a Zoom chat, something I've thought a bit about. I'll just say for now, I'll give you the cheesy answer. We just don't have time. But I actually think there's really interesting points to be made about third-party candidates and climate change. So maybe we could talk about that later. But for now, let's focus on the Trump administration. Ackbar, if you can help me, here we go. Some basic points to cover. Yeah, I mean, the goal is to kind of think about their approach to climate change. And the number one point I want to at least argue with you is there's not really a Trump administration climate agenda or policy or plan. I just, I don't think it's there. I think that there's been some evolution from saying climate is a hoax to now sort of maybe vague lip service to some of the science, some minor maybe moves towards plans that might reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but there's really not a systematic plan or focus on climate change at all. So if I can convince you that's the case, why is that the case? And I think it's because of this story. Look, we're talking about climate change philosophy. And one of the things we've been saying that in addition to the science, there are all these philosophic dimensions, and some of them have to do with the fancy word being hermeneutics, right? Interpretation, meaning making, rhetoric, the way we weave a story together. And so I want to talk about that story. I'm going to use that video that I had you watch of President Trump's speech at an oil rig to just give you what I think the kind of story is and say that climate change really doesn't fit into it. And then I'll conclude just by tying this into, I know many of you are interested in ecomodernism. You love it, you hate it, you're ambiguous about it, but you find it interesting, as do I. I want to say a bit about how the Trump administration's deregulatory and energy dominance agenda in a way looks like ecomodernism, but it's not really. So that's kind of where I want to go today. Okay, first, what do I mean there's no climate focus? Well, I mean, that's probably evident if you've been paying attention to politics at all. But look, I just went to, by the way, all of this is linked in your notes. This is the Trump campaign's 2020 re-election website, and there's kind of an issues tab, and I went to energy and the environment. And, we'll compare this to Biden next week on his kind of analogous site, although he's got one specifically about his climate plan. And that's the point here, right? What is energy and the environment about for the Trump administration? Well, sorry, I cut the top one off a little bit there, but the Department of Interior having the largest oil and gas lease ever in the Gulf of Mexico. The Trump administration acting aggressively to increase exports of energy resources, which means liquefied natural gas, a fossil fuel, to other countries. Point three, President Trump approving infrastructure and the resources needed to unleash oil and gas production in the US. President Trump rescinding the Clean Power Plan, which was Obama's kind of signature climate domestic policy, and replacing it with this affordable clean energy rule, which I'll say a bit about more. On the right side, signing legislation to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to energy production, getting the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines going, again, repealing the Clean Power Plan, and of course, keeping the promise to get America out of the Paris Climate Agreement. So, insofar as climate is mentioned by way of an agenda or a platform, it's really to say that the whole climate issue is something that's job killing if you take it seriously. So that's what I mean. Climate change just isn't factor in as a serious policy agenda item for the Trump administration. Why? Well, here's this story. This is what I pieced together from that speech, and I'm interested what you take away from it, because it's not. This isn't the way it's explicitly presented. I'm trying to kind of piece together what is the narrative on display, not just in the speech, but I found it to be emblematic of the worldview or the discourse, right, animating this administration. So this comes later in the speech, but I think it's really primary in terms of logical progression, is the American way of life. It's the best life ever. And he mentions in there suburbia as a kind of iconic or emblematic of that way of life. So that's, I think, at the core of it. Like, we have prosperity. The way we live is the greatest way of living. And it's made possible by energy. But you should note already, energy just means fossil fuels. I mean, that's really a key point. When they talk about energy dominance or unleashing American energy, they're not talking about sun and wind. Okay, not primarily. They're talking about oil, natural gas, and indeed even coal. There's something patriotic about oil and about fossil fuels. And so, given that we have the greatest way of life possible, that it's made possible by energy, we're going to do everything we can to unleash this energy so that we can extract it, so that we can use it to perpetuate this way of life, right? So we're approving pipelines, removing regulations, opening up more land and water for extraction. This is what I mean by the deregulation agenda. So let me just pause there for a second. Deregulation is a long tradition, especially in conservative or Republican circles, and there is certainly something to be said for the idea that too much regulation can stifle innovation, it can stifle job creation, it can lower prosperity. And so when it comes to environmental regulations or any kind of regulations, you want to shoot for the sweet spot, as it were. And the argument would be, well, there's too many regulations, so we're going to remove some of those. That's in general this idea of deregulation. Now, I might argue to you, and I have in other pieces I published, that this agenda can be pushed too far to the other side of the sweet spot. But I think that's one of the key moves. It's very obvious. And in fact, in your notes, I put a couple of regulatory rollback trackers, one from Harvard that focuses on environmental regulations, one from Columbia University that focuses on climate specifically. You can go through and browse those and you'll find over 80, at least the time I'm recording this, 80 different environmental regulations that the Trump administration is in some process of trying to or successfully pulling back, rescinding, removing. So domestic energy means we control our fate and we can influence other nations. So you hear this America first a lot, America first energy, or energy dominance. Okay, so this is the other key piece here. The US is now, although this is kind of tricky because we actually do import a lot of crude oil. But in general, the claim is, and I think he's right on this, that we are a net energy exporter because we're doing so much now to export liquefied natural gas. It's really interesting. It wasn't that long ago that we were building facilities to import natural gas, but thanks to the fracking revolution we'll talk about next week, we're now exporting a lot of natural gas. And so in the history of US energy policy, there's a lot of talk about energy independence. That is, that we won't be dependent on foreign nations for our energy supplies. And that's a national security issue. The Trump administration is the first one to talk about energy dominance, which I think means not just energy independent, but actually being an energy exporter. And again, energy means fossil fuels in particular. We mean here liquefied natural gas. We can become an exporter so that we can actually dominate the market. We can dominate international politics or geopolitics. That's the idea behind energy dominance. No, there's a claim in that speech that he's increased, well, that not Trump himself, but under the Trump administration, domestic oil production has gone up 3.1 million barrels per day. And he said there's never been a number like that. Well, actually, the Obama administration increased domestic crude oil production by 3.8 million barrels per day. Part of this narrative is the enemy. Right? So our way of life is the best, but there's a sort of enemy on the inside who wants to tear it down. And so quite a bit of this speech is about the radical left. They want to destroy our way of life, and they're going to do it by undermining energy. They are, quote, sick, and they don't love our country. Now, he does talk about climate change, at least indirectly, by referencing the Green New Deal, which he claims will abolish fossil fuels. Now, we've studied this fairly well, and I think we know, well, kind of that's the goal, but it's not like an overnight thing, right? The idea is to decarbonize the economy through all of these policy maneuvers to get us weaned off of fossil fuels. But it's not going to be overnight. Again, big picture, climate change not mentioned except as to say how expensive climate policies are and how they're not possible. It's really interesting how impossible it is. He says a couple of times, all of these dreams of decarbonize the economy, he says, not possible. And I think we should know enough by now, when we've studied externalities, a little bit of the economics of climate change, to know that we need to be careful when we talk about pricing policies, right? Because it could be that things are cheap now simply because the real costs are not built into the price. And it could be the case that regulations might increase the costs in some ways when a certain accounting is taken into account, right? But if you account in a different way, it actually reduces costs. And it may actually lead to innovations that create jobs and create prosperity and create wealth. So all of that, let's just say, we'd have to get into the details on. But this is just to say, in the story, anything related to climate is expensive and impossible, right? So I think that's the story. We have the greatest way of life ever. It's built on fossil fuels. Therefore, we need to keep fossil fuels going. And we need to be very wary of the sick, country-hating people who want us to get away from fossil fuels. Right. Okay. Oh, gosh, last one, clean air and water. We actually love our environment. So this is an interesting nod to environmental issues. There's often this shift from climate change to clean air and water, which is not quite the same thing, right? And I'll say a bit about this a little bit later on, because yes, there are these decoupling trends where actually American prosperity, economically measured with the GDP, has grown up, even as measures of air and water quality have also increased, right? So environmental harm has decreased as prosperity, economic growth has increased. But there's an interesting trend in just a second I'll get to. So on that note, that decoupling note, this kind of looks like an ecomodernism tale because look, there's a big focus on innovation and economic growth and market forces, and technology and modernity, right? This way of life is a modern way of life. And again, this reliance on decoupling to justify the approach, this innovation, economy, growth approach. So that's, I think, how it can look like ecomodernism, right? Look, we're going to keep the economy growing, we're going to keep jobs going, and we're going to do it all in a way that decouples from environmental harms. You could say, oh, okay, maybe it's a little bit rough on the edges, because I don't think anybody would say President Trump is trying to be the most eloquent speaker, but this is just eco-modernism, right? Well, no, it's not, or at least that's what I want to argue to. So my last point, I have this in your notes. Back to that air quality deal. You remember when we talked about decoupling? Boy, I think we talked about it in terms of the London smog situation. Does that ring a bell? I hope this rings a bell. But the basic idea is, look, how did London get wealthier while its air quality increased? So how did it get wealthier while air pollution went down? So decoupling. Well, it did primarily through the passage of national clean air regulations, right? So regulations can spur the innovation that can lead to decoupling. And any good eco-modernist today, and we've read several of them, I want you to think about Nordhaus, for example, who has a big role for government to play in his vision of a green economy. Any good eco-modernist would say that we do need government regulations. Sometimes we need big regulations to make massive shifts in the economy. So we've actually seen an increase in some air pollutants between 2016 and 2018. That's what this study is showing. Now, there's different reasons for it. We can't lay it all at the feet of the Trump administration environmental deregulatory agenda, but some of it we can. I put that red line there. Some of this decreasing air quality comes from decreasing enforcement of the Clean Air Act. You know, those regulations really play a role in terms of cleaning up our air. You can't just say it's all economic growth and innovation without the guiding hand of government regulations to steer that growth and innovation in the right way. Okay. This other one, real quick. So, what's going on here? In 2009, the EPA issued what's called the endangerment finding, which says the US has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions one way or another. Okay. The Obama administration did this through its Clean Power Plan, CPP. Now, the Trump administration, we've already seen, has scrapped that away and is replacing it with this Affordable Clean Energy Rule. This is a study on that rule I've got linked in your notes. Now, the CPP promoted a wide range of options to reduce CO2 emissions. It said, on the one hand, you can make coal-fired power plants more efficient, and on the other hand, you can also incentivize carbon-free renewable forms of energy production. What the ACE does, this Trump approach, removes the latter part of it, and it focuses entirely on efficiency measures at coal plants. So it's taking away all of the incentives that were there for renewable energy, or at least the pathways that were there under this Clean Power Plan regulatory framework to get to the stated objectives. It says, no, we're only going to make coal-fired power plants more efficient. Guess what? Remember, we've studied efficiency, right? Jevons paradox, also known as the rebound effect. Lo and behold, it comes up in the study, and they say, well, if you're only going to increase the efficiency of coal-fired power plants, you might get a rebound effect where actually the lifespan of those coal-fired power plants is extended, and you get used more than they otherwise would be because now they're more efficient, right? So the conclusion is you probably will still get a little bit of reduction in CO2. Okay, this is from this study, but not nearly as much as you are going to get under the Clean Power Plan. And unfortunately, because no matter how efficient from a heat standpoint these coal-fired power plants are, you're still going to get SO2 and NOx emissions, which are bad air pollutants. So a lot of that's in the details. Let me step back and say, here's the punchline. This isn't ecomodernism, right? Why? Well, if you think about Julian Simon, who was one of our icons of the eco-modernist perspective, he said, what we're betting on is a process here, the process of the human mind, okay, being the smartest thing, the best resource we've got, right? So we use our ingenuity to find more of a resource or replacements for it. If copper wire gets expensive, people don't want copper wire. People want in-home entertainment. So we can go from copper to satellites, or we can go from copper wire to fiber optic wire or something, right? We're smart, we'll figure it out. But the Trump administration is betting on a substance, not a process, okay? It's like as if Julian Simon said, I'm really in favor of copper wire. So the Trump administration is in favor of fossil fuels. So it can look like, oh, innovation, right? Deregulation to unleash innovation, but it's always for fossil fuels. All this innovation is for the favored fuels. All this deregulatory effort is systematically in favor of fossil fuels. That example I just gave you is just one of those where it shows, oh, here's a chance that we can favor coal-fired power plants, you know? And when it comes to our regulatory or deregulatory agenda, it's almost entirely in favor of how do we get more oil and gas out of the ground? How do we do our best to prop up a dying coal industry? This is the running motif. It's all about fossil fuels. It's not really about the creative, ingenious process of the human mind finding new and better resources. It's almost the opposite of that. It's like, how can we stick with the resources we've had for so long? And it makes me wonder if this isn't part of the Make America Great Again trope, that there's something backwards looking about it, right? So it's just to say this whole image of what makes America great that we started our story with, it's somehow built into fossil fuels, and we need to keep that core there. I think that's what's really interesting, driving narrative. Part of this, maybe all of it, is just raw politics. If you look at where the electoral votes are, and you look at where the fossil fuel resources are, there's maybe a clean mapping of that. But there's also really something deeply powerful and nostalgic about this appeal to fossil fuels. More significantly, maybe than all of that, is we know any good eco-modernist takes climate change seriously. Now, they don't think it's an asteroid, right? They think it's diabetes, right? Diabetes for the planet. That's serious. Okay, it's not an emergency, but we've got to tackle it. And that's clearly not, or I would argue at least, clearly not what we see in the Trump administration. I think really, again, what we've seen is at best a shift from calling climate change a hoax to kind of vague lip service about climate change, every once in a while throwing in a dime or something, but nothing like, I think, the scale of a response we need if we position ourselves somewhere in that broad climate consensus where the eco-modernists are. Okay. All right, well, I better wrap up there. I went longer than I wanted to. Ackbar saying elections have consequences. I'll end on this slide. If you go to those regulatory rollback trackers in your notes, and if you're interested, that's where I'd go. It's a great source, both Harvard and Columbia. I know the Harvard one, for example, has these CAFE standards, which are fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. One of the regulatory rollbacks that the Trump administration has done is to kind of freeze fuel efficiency, fuel economy standards for automobiles in the US. So it used to be under the Obama administration that there was a kind of an agenda, a plan that cars made in 2025 will have to have this much miles per gallon. And in 2030, the miles per gallon standards are going to go up. And in 2035, they're going to go up from there, so that we're forcing automobile manufacturers through regulations to get innovative about making more fuel efficient cars, right? Trump administration has scrapped that and frozen it. It says if you make a car in 2035, it can have the same miles per gallon as a car made in 2020, right? That has significant consequences. And that's just what this graph shows you, that on the worst case scenario, if you have low oil prices, which we have now because of the pandemic, you could be looking at 880,000 barrels per day of more oil use than you otherwise would have had if you wouldn't have scrapped those regulations, right? Am I saying that? 880,000. Yeah, I think I'm reading that right. Barrels of oil every day as a result of this one sort of deregulatory decision. So we didn't today have time to go into all 80 of the deregulatory decisions, by the way, some of which are unsuccessful, right? Many of which have been successful, though. I would say that, and I linked to David Roberts' piece. You know I like his stuff. I'm sorry. I linked a piece in your notes. I think he's right to say that another 4 years of the Trump administration just simply is bad news when it comes to climate change. Okay, that's probably the takeaway. All right, well, on behalf of Ackbar, until next time, I'm wishing you all a great day. I hope you participate in our democratic process. Get out there and vote. And until next time, may the force be with you.